sets at home.
I've got
All
three
right,
in my car.
welcome. Thank you for coming. Hopefully there will be some more gaggles of people joining us. There's Bill. Here they come. Just exactly. Good devil. So I'm Kristen Klopfenstein, and I'm a senior researcher with the Texas Schools Project, and I run the seminar series, as most of you likely know by now. And today we'll be hearing from Jessica Howell, who I met years ago at
A lifetime ago.
Yes, at APAM through John Kane, and he decided he really liked Jessica and he really liked me, so he put us together in a couple sessions, and the rest is history. So now, 3 lifetimes later, here we are. So Jessica is currently an associate professor at Sacramento State, and I just heard that she has accepted a position starting a brand new education policy research center in DC for the College Board. So that is a very, very welcome news. And they're very fortunate to have you, and we look forward to seeing what comes out of that shop. So today we're going to be hearing about her investigation of California's early assessment program, and I know that this work is, she's interested in getting a lot of our feedback, kind of given our knowledge of the situation from Texas, so she'll be interested in your questions and comments. She's, the typical economist, ed researcher trained at UVA, and does really good work. So please join me in welcoming Jessica Howell.
Thank you for the lovely introduction and for coming. I'm happy to see that there are cookies. That always makes any of this go over a little bit better when it's at lunchtime. So I'm going to be presenting work that is joint with an interdisciplinary team. So Mikal Kurlander is an ed researcher at the University of California at Davis. And Eric Grodsky used to be at Davis, but he is a sociologist who's now at the University of Minnesota. And we all have common research interests and oddly similar skill sets, despite our very different training. So we work really well together. The work that I'm going to be talking to you about today has been funded by the IES in a couple of grants. The first of which is really the primary research results that I can share today, and the second bigger grant is to replicate and extend that work. And so I hope to have some time to talk about that as well. So let me give you some context for what I think a lot of people would agree is the basic problem, or one of the basic problems going on in the United States. There are a lot of students that come through our doors on campuses that are really underprepared for college level work. There's a good deal of evidence that suggests that they really are just very uninformed about what it will take to be successful in college. And the evidence that we see is that there are very, very high rates of remedial course taking on college campuses as well. And I'll show you some evidence on that in just a second. Despite this underpreparedness, over time we've seen big increases in college enrollment rates, right? So my parents' generation, about half of them went to college. Currently about 2/3 go on to college of high school graduates. And so college enrollment rates have continued to grow, although we have some issues about how well prepared those younger cohorts are. But despite this, we actually have seen very, very flat, stagnant college degree completion rates in this country. And of course, anytime you sort of turn on the news or the radio, you hear a whole variety of important people in important places talking about how the thing that we should be focusing on is getting this country's competitiveness back and really worrying a lot about improving degree completion rates in the US. And if you listen a little bit more closely, they're also very concerned about the fact that there are big gaps among populations that we care about in degree completion rates. Okay, so that's kind of the context for why we get into this stuff. Some possible explanations that a variety of people have talked about for stagnant degree completion. It might be that a lot of the data sets that we historically use to examine some of these issues are from previous cohorts, and that there have been really big compositional changes in who comes through college doors. And if you don't pay attention to some of these issues, you can really lose sight of what's going on. It might be because enrollment rates have increased and you have a lot more and a lot different people trying out the college waters, that some of them are learning that they're just not really that interested in what's going on there. Okay, so that's something that people don't often think about. Some Newcomers to college going might also face different financial constraints than previous generations. There might be some institutional things that are going on college campuses that we don't take a hard look at. And so in other research with Mikal and Eric, I actually look at several things that happen on university campuses far and wide that might impact how successful students are in college. But today I'm really going to talk to you about the academic preparation story and the fact that lots and lots of these kids are coming to school really underprepared to do college level work. And this issue speaks to sort of a bigger issue about maybe poor alignment between the K through 12 sector and higher ed. So when you talk about degree completion, I think you have to talk about academic preparation and vice versa. There's a whole variety of papers. I've chosen these because they're national or multi-state in scope to show you that it's really the rigor of the high school curriculum that is driving or the biggest predictor of college success and graduation. And I know that Kristen should jump in whenever she feels it necessary, because she's done a lot of work on this too, to show that academic rigor in high school really, really matters. And so we feel like in light of that information, if we can make some progress on how well prepared students are coming out of high school, that would really improve student success and would get us a long way toward meeting the goals that everybody's been talking about in terms of improving degree completion. So because one of the things I'm going to talk about is remedial education today, and because underprepared students that show up on college campuses often wind up in remedial courses, I think it's nice to take just a brief segue into talking about what we know about remedial education from the literature and the evidence on the effect of being remediated on later college outcomes is really very mixed. They're almost exclusively state-by-state studies. So a study of Ohio did identify some small positive effects on of remedial education on those students then transferring to four-year colleges, to more selective institutions, small positive effects on degree completion. But a similar examination in Florida really doesn't yield very much in the way of any effectiveness of remedial education. And Paco and Isaac used the Texas data to examine this, and they find no effects, maybe even some small negative effects of receiving remedial education. So when you look at this scant evidence, a couple of things come to mind. One, we should be really looking at this too, and we are. We don't have anything to share with you at this point yet, but we're looking, because we have a California data set, we're looking at the effectiveness of remedial education in California. But the other question is, given that the results are mixed on what colleges can do once you get to that point in the pipeline, why not also look further back in the pipeline and see what we can do to keep students out of remediation in the first place, right? Just kind of stands to reason. I started out doing higher ed, and I figure by the end of my career I'll be doing work on preschools because you just keep moving back further and further the more you know about these things. So in case anybody needed convincing that remediation in this country was high, this shows you, this is from fall 2002, and it shows you, at the public 2 years and the public 4 years, remediation rates are really quite high. Most students in this country are at public institutions, so those are the ones where I think you should really focus. And if you look at more updated data, they're actually higher now than they were in 2000. So I think among public 4 years, the rate is now more like 25, 26%. And ironically, it wasn't a chart like this that got me really interested in this stuff. It was a chart like this, which is for my system, the California State University system, looking at the proportion of first-time freshmen who come through our doors. And this is a 23 campus, biggest public university system in the country. And what we see is very high rates of math and English remediation need that have really remained steady over time. This is broken up by subject, but if you look by campus at anyone needing a remediation need, you're going to be really mortified. So this is the 23 campuses ordered by the proportion of first-time freshmen. These are regular admits too, by the way, that need remediation in math or English. System-wide, you can see it's upward of 50%, which is twice the national average. And my campus is at 60%, which is not a surprise to me because I teach introductory economics, and I'm being taped, so I won't be quite as forthcoming as I might be, but but I hope what you see here is that the high rates are not driven by outliers, right? There are a couple of outliers on either end, but most campuses fall between 50 and 75%, and so I think the word epidemic is probably not out of place to be used here. So when I arrived at Sac State in 2003, and when I first started to see some of these data, it was a little bit worse actually in 2003. My immediate reaction is, oh my goodness, what is being done about this, and is it having any effect? And so the good news is something was being done about it. It's called the Early Assessment Program, or the EAP. And the goal of the EAP is to really sort of go back into the pipeline and give students some information so that they can take some action regarding their college readiness. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about how that happens. But other parts of the EAP focus on really bringing together or better aligning some of the high schools and some of the CSUs and getting everybody kind of involved, and also providing some real tangible things that students can do to actively improve their academic preparation going into college. So the goals translate into three components. The first is a testing component, which I'll talk about in more detail, but basically in the 11th grade, students are offered a chance to receive some early information about their college readiness. The second piece is actually a fairly successful group of professional development activities where CSU folks go into local high schools and help high school teachers work on their curriculum and better align to what the expectations are going to be when they get to campus. And then the 12th grade intervention is providing some additional things, many of them online, that students can do and engage in when they're seniors to help them become better prepared. So we're going to focus in on the testing component. I'm a quantitative researcher, and so that is the best place to get some traction on this program, but recognize that these other things are also sort of going on, although I think that they're much smaller in scope in terms of the number of people that they're affecting. So the testing component. In the 11th grade, students have to take a mandatory standardized test. And so what they have done is add 15 questions to this standardized test. Those 15 questions are optional, so I'm going to obviously get back to talking about the voluntary nature of the program. And those additional items were developed by CSU faculty members in conjunction with what they already knew was going to be covered on the main standardized test. And so augmenting that standardized test score with these extra EAP items is going to generate a score for students. And they're not told what the score is because the founders sort of thought, no, that's too much information. Let's boil it down for them. Students in the summer before their senior year, they're told, you are exempt from having to take remedial coursework or even having to take sort of the placement exam. You are not exempt, meaning it doesn't look like you're going to be ready to go into college level work. Or in math, there is this sort of gray area where they can receive a conditional exemption and told, if you take math in your senior year, which many, many people don't because it's not a graduation requirement, or if you take a science class that has Algebra 2 or better as a prereq, and you get a C or better in that class, then we'll move you to exempt status and you'll be ready to take college level math. Okay, so that's sort of the gist of the information. So our natural research questions are around participation in the program and whether the participants in EAP that get that early signal of their college readiness, whether that influences their need for remedial coursework when they get to a CSU. We're also, because it's a voluntary program, we're going to have to pay attention to how EAP participation varies with individual characteristics, with attributes of the schools, and so we'll look at that too. And more importantly, we're going to have to devote some time to understanding how EAP works and to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences. Namely, we're worried about students, or I should say, I'm not so worried, but other people are worried about students getting the, nope, you're not exempt, you're not ready to do college level work, and feeling very discouraged and not bothering to go to college at all. And so we're going to look for some evidence that whether or not EAP affects college-going behavior, college application behavior, and the like, to see whether it has this sort of sorting effect. Personally, I wouldn't be that sad if it did, but it doesn't appear to, just as a hint. Sorry, I said that on camera. Oh well, I'm burning bridges anyway. So the data. You guys are in Texas. You are spoiled by the wonderful data, I don't know, mansion that John Kane created here. And in California, we are a big dysfunctional family that just doesn't have anything like this in place, which is why you never see any studies of crossing segments from California. And so my co-authors and I decided to use some brute force methods to make some of these agencies talk to one another. And truthfully, they just needed an arbitration situation where, don't tell them I said that, but, so that we could be the go-between, and it worked. We decided to start small, meaning start on my campus. So I went to the Sacramento State Office of Institutional Research and talked them into giving me data on 4 cohorts of first-time freshman applicants. The dates were chosen so that I would have 2 cohorts that were in high school before EAP was available in the state, and 2 cohorts when it was available statewide. And I literally cleaned up that data and walked it over to the California Department of Education, because these 2 entities don't speak to one another very well, and paid them to match it up to their database. And in their database, they have the students' standardized test scores, which the Cal State system does not. And more importantly, they have whether students participated in this early assessment program, and they know what the outcomes are. They know their scores, they know what signal they received, and so on and so forth. And because they were feeling generous after charging me $1 bazillion, they also, because I told them I want to be able to study things statewide and see whether or not EAP is affecting college-going behavior more broadly, they gave me the full state sample since program inception of all high school juniors, so that I can look at sort of EAP participation as it varies across different types of students and different types of schools, and so we're kind of doing some of that too. So, to give you a sense of participation rates, please.
What are you using to match the students?
Good question, actually, because in California, the identifier issue is a tricky one. Although my data set has social security numbers, the one that I got from the university, I know, right? The California Department of Education does not have any numeric student identifier, historically. And so they match on name, date of birth, high school, ethnicity, a whole variety of things. I don't think the match is anywhere near perfect, and I think, if anything, the ways in which the match missed are probably going to penalize people with certain names that are very common. In California, that's probably more likely to happen in certain race ethnicities. But for the most part, it's the best first pass that we can do, and we're going to replicate it actually with system-wide data to do the same thing. But that's a great question. So this is looking at, again, I'm only going to use the first 4 years for most of my analysis, but I have statewide data for a longer time horizon than that. And so we can see that math participation rates are sort of flat throughout the time period, ranging in the mid 70% or so. English participation has been on the rise. What I will tell you that participation, this is the proportion of high school juniors that sat down to take the test. Substantially fewer of them actually complete those additional 15 items, even if they start them. This is not really a problem in math because it's just those additional 15 items. In English, they also have an essay component. So in addition to the 15 items, in a separate session, they have to sit down and spend 45 minutes writing. So what happens is the actual EAP completion rate, so the proportion of students who get the information about their college readiness is about half as large in English, but math is about the same. Please.
Did the students know, if they score those 15 questions, which is voluntary, that will guess them for exemption or non-exemption from remediation?
Yep. So there's some question about how consistently the messaging was across schools. Right, we rely on school administrators and teachers and the like to convey these things. But students were, in many schools, told that those additional 15 items were optional, but that completing them would provide them with some information about whether or not they were prepared for college-level work. In some schools, we sort of know anecdotally that teachers just said, yeah, do them. sort of made them feel like they weren't voluntary. And so one of the things that I hope we'll have time to talk about is this notion that there are really big differences in school level participation rates, because some schools were like, yeah, we do AVID, we do this, we do that, we do it all, so just sit down and shut up and do it. In other schools, I think they're like, EAP, what's EAP? Oh, I don't know, you probably don't have to do that, right? So big variation in what happens within schools, which matters, and that's actually a whole separate paper as a result, but good question. So some summary statistics, again, to kind of show you some things. Not huge changes in demographic characteristics over time. We see, a little bit of movement in the racial composition of Sac State students, but nothing too crazy, nothing going on in parental education. You can see math proficiency starts and ends in about the same place. English proficiency, same thing. Nothing that jumps out at you as saying, well, there were major changes in other things going on at this time period.
Jess, where does your parental education variable come from?
So in this particular part of things, it is self-reported on the student's application.
So it's not part of like the FAFSA, or it's on every application?
It's on every application. And in some of our analyses that use the full set of California juniors, we have parental education that's collected by the CDE, the California Department of Education.
They collect it?
They do collect it. And it's not this detailed. It's, of your two parents, what's the highest degree, highest level of attainment? I know, but they do collect it. So we have some ability to judge that these variables aren't crap, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
They aren't particularly good, but for example, they're much better than the self-reported income, which we don't use, because that is crap.
Exactly, 'cause that's a mess,
Yeah. So a couple of acronyms, because we don't have enough, right? The entry-level mathematics is the test that you would have to take in order to demonstrate college readiness. And so if you wind up taking the ELM, that means that you didn't score high enough on the SAT, you didn't perform well enough in your math classes, right? There are other ways to demonstrate college readiness and opt out. Same thing for the English placement test. If you wind up taking that test, it means that you didn't score high enough on the SAT, you didn't take AP English and score high enough on the AP exam, right? There are a whole bunch of different ways that a student can say, yeah, I'm ready for college level work. But some students who aren't able to send that signal wind up having to take these remedial placement tests. You can see score-wise, there are not big changes in the scores on these tests. The only thing that has changed a little bit over the sample is the proportion who are taking them. Right, so we see some dips in the proportion taking them, presumably because after EAP is available, they have yet another way of demonstrating exemption. So you save some money in the sense that students aren't signing up to take these tests and dealing with the administration and whatever else.
That's not showing up in math. I mean, it's
Well, yeah.
a one-time blip, right?
It appears to be a one-time blip. Again, going out a little bit further,
Yeah.
we do see a trend going out a little bit further
Okay.
that isn't available in this
So the
particular
information
snapshot.
is getting disseminated slowly.
Right. Again, these are the first 2 years of a program that's rolled out statewide. So when I show you that we find effects, I'm actually feeling good about the fact that those effects are low compared to what we might be seeing now when we examine things statewide for the first 5-6 years of the program. Okay. But again, not huge changes in SAT, ACT, high school GPA, right? There's not huge changes in the quality of the student that's coming in that we would worry would confound things. And just as an aside, right, this is the average high school GPA among students who are enrollees. Again, we're restricting the sample to enrollees because we know for those students whether or not they wound up going into remediation or not. The scary statistic that I love to share with everyone is that if you look at the students who wind up in remedial courses, their average high school GPA is a 3.1. So these students, I feel for them, right? They went through high school and were told they were better than B students on average and got to college and said, sorry, you're not really ready to earn credits toward your college degree. That's really, really sad. That's bad alignment stuff. So yeah, there you have it. So our basic analytics strategy, not rocket science at all because we have decent data, is to model remediation need for first-time freshmen by subject specifically because these are two different animals. We have a bunch of individual characteristics, a bunch of high school characteristics. We need to pay attention to whether or not students were in a cohort that even had EAP available, and then whether or not they participated. So oh, that's sad. I hate it when that happens. This grade equation apparently is not useful. We're interested in this coefficient right here that shows you the effect of being in a cohort that had it available and that participated. Okay? Now, after we estimate this, and I'll share that with you next, let me just, before you jump in and attack, we do investigate selection into EAP. It's a voluntary program, as I've said, and so we want to pay attention to individual selection effects, school level selection effects. And then one thing that we are able to do that, or at least take a first pass at, that I think a lot of people just say, sorry, we can't do anything about, is to start to unpack the mechanism by which this works, because we care a lot about that. So, in my beautiful equation here, this is the propensity that you need remediation. It's obviously observed as a binary. You wind up in remediation or you don't, so we run logits, and these are marginal effects. So for example, an African American student is 15 percentage points more likely to wind up in English remedial classes than an otherwise observationally similar white student. Okay? That's kind of how you read these things. So our coefficients of interest are down here in the EAP participation line. This says that students who participated in the program have a probability of needing English remediation that is 6.1 percentage points lower than non-participants. And in math, marginally significant, still at the 10% level, about 4.1% decreased probability of needing remediation needs. So feeling pretty good about this in the sense that educational interventions often yield very, very small effects. So even though these are modest, if you translate them up into numbers, we're talking several thousand students every year.
This is like an economist dream, right?
Yeah.
It's information.
Yeah.
It's just information.
It's just information. There are a couple of other things. I mean, you know, I could point out lots of stuff. It's not surprising that you know, having more educated parents reduces your need for remediation in both subjects, although we have some statistical significance issues. One of the things that we think is really interesting, again, not surprising, the racial ethnic minorities wind up having higher probabilities of needing remediation than whites. The one that really is scary is that even after controlling for their standardized test score, parental education, and high school GPA, males still have an 18 percentage point lower probability of needing math remediation than girls. So this whole like girls can't do math stuff is really a concern, because you think that after you are comparing apples to apples that you don't have such big effects. So time permitting, we'll go down that path to look at some of the gender stuff. Yeah?
I assume you're going to get to the effect on college attendance, because one explanation for that could be that the people who were least prepared didn't go.
Yep, absolutely. I don't know that I'm going to show you anything that addresses that exactly, but that's exactly part of the story of unpacking the mechanism. Yep, you got it. Okay, so you know, one of the things that we'd like to do is to break down some of these effects for different types of students and schools and the like. And if you notice, our sample sizes, because we're dealing with one campus, are pretty small. So breaking down effects along, you know, the different subgroups that we'd like to just isn't tractable, and we're going to do that going forward when we have system-wide data. But for those of you who want to see sort of the distribution of the effect, what I have here is the standardized test score in English. This was the more statistically significant effect, so that's what we're looking at. The probability of needing remediation, and the two lines represent the higher black line are the people who didn't participate, the lower gray line are the people who did. And so to the extent that a gap opens up between that, that's the effect of participating in EAP as it varies over the distribution. The average student is getting about a 350, and so you can see that for the below average students, it's really a very small effect and pretty constant in terms of the size along some of the big proportion of above average students. So this is the kind of thing that we hope to do by race, ethnicity, and you know, looking at a whole variety of subgroup analyses that we just don't feel like we can get a very good traction on with this sample size.
That's a real effect. And
Yeah.
It's cheap.
And it's cheap.
It's cheap.
Well, you know, again, because we were just talking about cost-benefit analysis, I don't have any hard and fast numbers on the cost of this program, but it's pretty cheap relative to some, in the sense that, You're putting in some additional.
Well, relative to actual remediation, for example.
That's exactly right. No, actual remediation, I mean, I don't have a slide on that, but in this country, the estimates are that we spend about $500 million on remediating students, and wow, yeah, there have to be some cheaper ways of reducing remediation need. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about selection. Namely, we worry about selection at the individual level, that although we include a whole host of observable characteristics that certain types of individuals are selecting in, and that's biasing our results in some way. And so we use propensity score matching to sort of pair up people. We're pairing them up obviously on observables, but hoping that people who match on observable characteristics are more likely to match on some important unobservables. And so I'll show you the propensity score estimates. And then we're also, obviously concerned about selection at the school level, that some schools are opting in to this program for reasons that are potentially correlated with the outcomes that we're observing. So school effects model is not that exciting. One of the things that we do is we look at the subsample of schools that basically don't have any observed participation selection going on. So we look at the schools where 90% or more of students are participating in EAP and saying, well, here, there doesn't appear to be much selection, so let's see if our results hold up in these very high or near universal participation places. So the original model estimates for English and for math are in columns 1 and 4. Using propensity score to estimate an average treatment effect, we get slightly bigger results, although I would basically call those qualitatively the same. And then dealing with school level selection by focusing in just on the near universal participation schools, we get slightly smaller effects. So I don't think that this has solved selection problems, but I think it does give us some sense that selection is not driving the main result. And truthfully, in this past, that's convincing enough for me to say there are some modest effects in the direction we would hope from the early assessment program. So what's driving things, right? We care about the mechanism to some degree. Is it the case that EAP and the information that comes to these students who participate, does that actually encourage them to make better use of their senior year? Or is it simply, causing better sorting to occur? Are people getting the message and saying, ooh, maybe I'm not college level material? This is actually a really important question, I think, not very popular to ask in California, right? California is sort of course everybody should go to college. I think if they had 100% college enrollment, they would be really thrilled. So there's not much room in that state to talk about, well, not everybody is college level, college material. That's a very unpopular thing. So for me to say, if this causes better sorting, that's probably, an efficient result of the program. They don't want to hear that that's the result, they being, the greater non-economist population. And, from my standpoint, I think there are probably cheaper ways of sending a signal, so I'm kind of hoping that it's not just that. I would love to have some evidence that EAP is actually encouraging people to say, oh, you mean just getting a high school diploma doesn't mean that I'm going to go to college and take, really hard classes and succeed? So this idea that there's plenty of documented evidence that students don't have very good information about their own skill set and what's going to be useful to them in college, we really care. What we're going to try to do here is focus on the sorting story, because it's the one that our data really allows us to shine some evidence on. And I can talk to you a little bit about the transcript study that is forthcoming to deal with whether or not they're actually doing something different in their senior year. And this one shows up. Isn't that funny? It's PowerPoint versus just copying it from Word. So basically, we're going to look at whether or not somebody was an applicant to Sacramento State, and we're going to assume that that's a function of a bunch of their individual characteristics, school characteristics, and the signal that they got, right? So there are sort of 4 places that you can find yourself in. You're either a non-participant, even though EAP was available to you, or you were told you were exempt or not exempt. And in math, of course, there's this gray area, the conditional exemption. Okay. There was something else I was going to say here. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So again, in light of the conversation that we just had about selection effects, we want to make sure that when we're looking at this stuff that we don't have anything that's muddied by selection effects. And because in California, the Cal State systems are really very much regional colleges, we're going to estimate this equation, but on a small subsample. We're going to focus in on just Sacramento County high schools. Okay, so those high schools are the ones that by and large feed this university. And that's true across the state, actually, they're regional. And we're going to focus on the high participation rate high schools so that we don't worry about sort of individual or school level selection. Yeah.
What's the omitted category?
People who did, that's a great question, I should have said that. People who didn't have EAP available, right? So pre-cohorts that from the same schools. Yeah, right, sorry. Let me step back. So this is going to be comparing students who participated and got an exemption to observationally similar peers from those same high schools and everything else who didn't even have EAP available, okay? So what do we find? Let's do English first. We use the estimates to come up with a probability of applying to CSUS, or Sacramento State, for people who got different signals. And so again, pre-EAP, the fitted probability is about 15.7% probability of applying if you just live in one of those counties and attend high school in one of those high participation schools. And what we find is that the students who were told they were exempt are actually a little bit less likely than their pre-EAP observationally equivalent peers to apply. And the students who are not exempt are actually a little bit more likely. And in the non-participants, these are weird folks, right? Because these are the high participation rate schools. So the folks who had EAP available but didn't participate are really not the ones who are likely to be college bound anyway. But the point here is that this 2.5 percentage point difference between the not exempt and the exempt goes in the opposite direction of a sorting story. The sorting story would tell you that the folks who got the not exempt would be less likely to apply than the people who got the exempt, and we see the opposite.
There's other institutions out there, so the exempt ones are probably going to Harvard or wherever. I mean, let's be all optimistic. And
sure.
How does that?
So this is studying one institution, right? We don't have the ability to track them. And in future data, we'll have the ability to see whether they went to a different CSU. Right, but we don't have any ability to say, yeah, maybe. It's already kind of a data nightmare, but maybe. I guess what I'm saying is we're worried about the not exempt being discouraged. They're relative to their, so maybe the comparison that gets more traction is for this. Right, so I understand your point completely. The idea here is that relative to observational equivalent people who went to those high schools before EAP was available, the not exempt folks are actually more likely to apply. They're not discouraged at all by being told that they're not college ready. Okay, so.
Or maybe they were applying to Harvard and not Sac State, now they're applying to Sac State only.
I don't want to pick on your example, but I don't think we have a lot of overlap with Harvard.
Whatever.
Yeah. No. Again, this is the best that we can do to start talking about the mechanism.
That's plausible, right?
Totally plausible.
Okay,
Sure.
just
Yeah.
checking.
No, it is. In math, none of these are statistically different. Okay, so the folks who are exempt or not exempt aren't any different than their pre-EAP peers. The one that is statistically different in math is that gray area, right? The folks who got the conditional exemption are much more likely than everybody else, so pick your comparison that you like, much more likely to apply than anybody else. Now, one of the reasons that we hope to do a little bit more work on the conditional exemption is because that signal comes with more information than any of the others, right? If you get the signal that you're not ready for college, so that you're not exempt from taking the remedial course placement exam, namely, then basically you're told, go to this website, here are some supplemental things, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, but it's kind of loose compared to the people who get the conditional exemption are told in order to gain an exemption, to move from this category to the don't worry about it, go take college level classes. In order to make that move, they're told you have to take one of these courses in your senior year, you have to get a C or better, do these things and you're golden. And so they're given something really explicit And if you buy the story that students are sort of informationally challenged, maybe that signal is better because it provides very concise path information. So let me wrap up and then move to new stuff, if that makes any sense. How am I doing on time here? So yeah. So the conclusion, I should say this paper is recently came out in JPAM, and so what's done is done for the Sacramento analysis. We basically did this work so that we could demonstrate to the different segments in California that see what we're capable of if you just give us data. And so it was really a relationship building exercise that wound up, I think, being a good enough paper in its own right. But the whole point of it was to demonstrate what we were capable of and sell them on the idea that they should give us data for the entire CSU.
Did you point out to them that their B students weren't ready for college, and did that build your relationship?
We did. I haven't talked about that explicitly in, say, a room full of teachers, but I have for sure.
But that's important.
It's disgusting.
The signal is
Yeah. So modest effects of participating in the program on remediation probabilities. That's good. That's what we would expect, given that we're spending a little bit of money on this program. The mechanism, so I should say that I share these slides with some co-authors, and so I don't really feel comfortable saying quite something as strong as this. I feel like we have done what we can with this data to demonstrate that it doesn't look like it's sorting. That doesn't mean that it is, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's through better academic preparation. We need more evidence. So going forward, the second IES grant is going to enable us to do a massive transcript study, which is really what you need, right? You need to be able to go in and look at individual students and compare to their peers from some pre-period, how is their course taking different depending upon what signal they got. And so that's something that we'll do. We now have the money, we just need sort of the time to make it happen. And more importantly, what this did was it demonstrated to the CSU Chancellor's Office and to the California Department of Education that we're trustworthy, that we're going to do good things with their data, that this is useful information for everybody going forward. And so what we have now in our grubby little fingers is system-wide data over a longer time horizon, right? So I think it's maybe the first 6 years of the program and maybe 3 pre-years. That data is being cleaned and prepped, and again, we'll walk it over to the California Department of Education, and they'll conduct this match for bazillions of dollars and give it back to us. And we'll replicate what we've done here, but at a system-wide level. A lot more power, obviously, to do the kinds of subgroup analyses that obviously need to be done. And more importantly, we have the ability to sort of look for differences across campuses. So every CSU campus has an early assessment program coordinator, and their job is basically outreach with all the high schools in their quote-unquote service region. And there's, I think, a lot of variation in terms of how good that EAP coordinator is and how they interact and the kinds of relationships that they have going from the high school to the sort of community colleges in the area to the four-year colleges in the area. And so we're going to be able to supplement with even some qualitative information describing some of the relationships and some of the choices that go on specific CSU campuses because we have bigger data. And I already said this, looking for differential effects of EAP across important subpopulations that we care about and attributes of the high school attended, which leads me to the school differences, okay? So we see really big differences in EAP participation rates across schools. And we care about this because it's confusing, but we also kind of care about it because there are lots and lots of programs out there that are rolled out and rely on school level buy-in to kind of make happen. And I don't think that we understand all that much about take-up and how schools gather information about new programs and what they're supposed to be doing and the like, and get everybody in their school on board. And so we care about it, from that perspective. So what kinds of school attributes influence EAP participation rates? Obviously, we have a whole host of things that we can look at, but let me first show you. This is for the first 3 years of the program. breaking up participation rates into deciles and looking at what proportion of schools fall into different deciles. So you see that, over the first 3 years of the program, something in the vicinity of 10% of schools didn't participate at all. This is for English. And something in the vicinity of about a quarter of schools had near universal participation, and the gamut in between, right? So when I say there's a lot of variation in school level participation, this shows you. In math, it's a little bit more geared toward participation. We think that some of this might be related to the fact that the math folks work a little bit differently. In order to be eligible to participate in the math EAP, you have to have completed Algebra 2, and you have to be actually taking a math class. And so it's a much smaller subset of students that are even eligible. And the reason for this is because those are the students that are eligible to take the state standard test. The math results are for a more college-ready group to begin with. And so we see some different results by them. So to convince you that it's not a district story, isn't this the weirdest graph you ever saw? My ed researcher colleague put this together. So let me explain. Take districts and sort them according to the highest participating school in their district. And so you see some have 0 and very small, and some have very, very high participating schools. But each line is a district and represents the range of participation rates among schools in the district. So for example, we can pick any one of these lines over here where the best school in terms of participation is at 100%, and they still have some schools that are at 0. It's not a district story. This is not something that's happening at the district level, like so many things. I know, it's a hideous graph, right? But it conveys, for a group of economists, you could say, well, the amount of variation attributed, within district is this compared to across districts. But to a group of ed researchers, they just look at you and say, I need a visual. So I actually think that this is the perfect graph. So here it is in English, here it is in math. Again, we have lots and lots of variation across schools, even within a district, which is confusing to us because we know that there are lots of programs where important things happen at the district level, and this is not one of them. So what kinds of high school characteristics matter here? Well, so California has a high school exit exam called Csus, and so the percent passing, this is looking at math, the percent passing the high school exit exam, looking at the correlation with EAP participation, not surprisingly it's positive, sort of better schools churning out better quality students are more likely to participate, although there are some zeros here too, right? So. Looking at, again, in California, we have the Academic Performance Index, which is sort of a measure of school quality, of academic quality of the schools. And you would expect a positive relationship, and we sort of see that in the correlation in the scatter plot. These are just informative things that we would expect to see. We also have a whole host of scatter plots that are just, buckshot up on the thing where there aren't the kinds of relationships that you would expect. If you regress school level participation rates on a variety of school level characteristics, some of them matter. So the higher the proportion minority at the school, the higher the participation rate. Similarly, the higher the rate of take-up for free and reduced price lunch, the higher the participation rate. We have some anecdotal evidence from people on the ground who tell us that these are the schools where they really struggle to get their students through, and so they participate in everything. Like, we're going to do AVID, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to do that, and by the way, take these EAP questions, and so that it's not billed as voluntary, it's billed as this is another thing that we're going to do to try to get you out that door and into college successfully, so we're not really surprised to see that. Again, here's the relationship with the high school exit exam, but no relationship with, sort of the teacher quality measures that we have in terms of teacher experience. Little bit of a relationship that you might expect with credentialing. Okay, so I put this up here. What's next? Nothing. I put this up here because we're kind of confused, right? So we're trying to work on this schools level paper, this schools story about why we see so much variation across schools in the way in which schools sign on board and get their students into a program that has some demonstrated, positive effect on academic preparation, and we don't know what the story is. And so I'm not really sure where to go from here in terms of telling the right school story. With the statewide data and the system-wide data that we're going to have at our disposal very shortly, we can imagine that there might be some differences around CSU campuses. Again, the notion that in some communities, the relationship between the CSU and the high schools is better than in other communities, and so there might be just better messaging that goes on. These are all very intangible things, so we feel like in order to complete this school level story, we might have to supplement with some qualitative stuff, which is just not my general forte. But that's why we have some ed researchers and sociologists. They love that stuff. So yeah, so that's all the stuff that I have planned. I'm happy to have some more questions or. No pressure either. You can go back for more cookies. Yeah, please.
Could you go back to that graph you had with the effects, the two curves that were side by side, and
Two curves. Oh, right. Yeah.
yeah. English on the bottom.
Yep.
I've got the sense that you were.
Yeah. This guy.
I mean, basically, I think those two curves have to look that way because it's the model. And so, and if you wanted to make some point about how there's a consistent effect of that middle range or something, you have to put in a term that would allow the slope to vary according to English. Right now,
Fair enough.
So
No, you're right.
It's just a shift in the intercept.
No, you're absolutely right. Thank you. That's a great suggestion. So in truth, this is simply giving you a visual representation of the effect that we estimate rather than truly breaking it down. Yep. Got it. Yep. Absolutely right. Yeah, please.
Is there any possibility that you could look at things like the CST score, student grades, and so on, to eliminate the need for these extra questions?
Yeah, right.
To generate the exempt and non-exempt.
Right. It's funny. That's a phenomenal question, right? Can't we do well enough with the CST score, with the standardized test that we have? Are these 15 extra questions so crucial? So there has been a validation study of EAP that indicates that it is crucial. Achieve came in at the request. So some background is that EAP is something that initially the community colleges, the CSU, and the UC system, they were all at the table, but in the end, CSU is the only one that climbed on board for it. This past fall is the first time that the community colleges are all accepting EAP too. And so they were very concerned about, like, don't we have enough information? Really, what is this? How does this line up with Accuplacer and some of the other tests that we are forcing our students to come in? Now we have to take EAP, but we're used to getting this, and is it the same? And so Achieve came in and did a validation study of EAP and concluded that that there isn't enough information in just the standardized test to do as good of a job predicting. Yeah. Yeah.
Then the complementary question is why don't they just embed those questions? Or are they just so different in difficulty or domain?
Truthfully, that's an excellent question. I don't know the answer. Right?
If they're not aligned to the curriculum, perhaps
Right.
the curriculum should
I mean, the
change.
essay is one thing, but
Right.
for the math, which is
Well, you're kind of getting at some of the impetus behind the professional development activities. So the professional development activities that are a part of that are under the early assessment program have English faculty members in the Cal State system putting together modules, right, a curriculum for a senior level and even a junior level English experience, and going down and running workshops to sort of teach English teachers how to do it differently than what they've done it before. So some of these things are trying to be embedded in the curriculum through the other portions of EAP. You're
not prepping for the EAP question.
Are they going to teach the test?
No, it's definitely, I don't think it's that, in the sense that the people who are involved in writing the supplemental EAP questions are not the same people that are doing the professional development activities. Yeah, fingers crossed on that one, right? But your question is actually a really good one. Why don't we just change the CST? And maybe that's something that will happen eventually once they realize that the curriculum has had a chance to sort of catch up with, to be better aligned with what's expected in college. Maybe it's the kind of thing where we also need the community colleges and the UCs on board so that we have a standardized test that speaks to what everybody thinks needs to
But you can
happen.
still have differential scoring. I mean,
Yeah,
if you score the OCST with, you just score those items for that, you have that
Yeah.
supplement, but embed them as we do with field test items.
Fair enough.
The tests are produced by an
ETS.
independent company,
ETS.
so with their own psychometricians who have their
Yeah,
own way of doing
exactly.
things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but it's perfectly legitimate suggestions. Again, it's easier for us to demonstrate that the supplemental questions and the signal and the extra information is having the effect that they would intend. Because if I'm being perfectly honest, at the chancellor's office, they would be happy saying that, oh, the early assessment program is wildly successful. Look at how high the participation rates are. I know, right? It makes us laugh. But they're like, what? And I say, well, isn't the point to reduce remediation because that's what's so costly and there's no evidence, no good evidence maybe that remediation is really doing right by these kids and, shouldn't we really be checking that? Well, I guess. So, baby steps, baby steps. Yeah.
So you're going to get National Student Clearinghouse data for your next step, for your big study then? Because you don't have all those other choices, right? And it seems to me that you're just, it may be that CSU football isn't as good as it was 2 years ago or something, and that's influencing whether or not kids are applying, right?
It's going to be important for the sorting question.
It is important for the sorting question. Identifying the effect of EAP, it doesn't matter, right? Having statewide data, we will have the universe of all high school juniors, and we'll know which ones applied to a CSU. And I think that there's, I don't know any way other than this way of finding out whether or not they wound up someplace else. At this particular juncture, we haven't budgeted or planned that in. But I think that it's certainly something that's going to be necessary to get more at the mechanism question. So the mechanism question is also going to be, in part, answered by looking at transcripts, right? So the transcript study is something that will be, California statewide, looking at a sample of transcripts, I should say a sample of schools, every transcript within those schools, to see whether or not, compared to their pre-EAP cohorts, they're making different choices than we would predict them to make based on, the observables that we have. The biggest, actually, ironically, the biggest pitfall that we encounter when we go and we talk to practitioners of, whether it's superintendents or it's actually, math teachers or whatever, is the timing. So again, information is good, but early information is better, and students are getting this information in the summer before their senior year, and they've already registered for classes.
Yeah.
And so if you sit around a room with the teachers and some people who are teachers union reps, they have a real hard time committing to the notion that the schools should be flexible enough to offer more classes, more math classes, if the students get this message that says, in order to, get into college and be successful,
It needs to be earlier. You need to have more early and often.
the problem is that the timing of the tests is, it's spring, and by the time those things are scored and letters go out, it's summer. And so we'd like, the program has been around enough that we'd like for schools to try to be a little bit proactive in terms of budgeting some cushion, because they clearly know that some students are going to show up and say, I've been told I have to take math, where do I go, what do I do? And again, there's been a lot of pushback about having any flexibility.
Well, so that's another good question from the transcript study. If they're told they need it,
Yeah, and they don't do it, and
they
is
can't
there,
get it,
is there evidence of capacity?
Because they choose not to, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might also look at calculating the measure that's being used in Chicago.
Tell me more.
They have something that they call an on-track indicator. You don't know about all that?
I don't, no.
Okay, well, it's from the
On-track.
Chicago Consortium on School Research, and
But that's
Tony
based
Bright,
on course
et
passing.
cetera.
And if
Yeah,
she's
it's based on
finding,
early course passing. No,
she's
So
finding
if
they
we have
have a
transcripts.
3.1 grade average, so they're passing the courses. That's not the problem.
Yeah.
So I think that this gets
It's
deeper in
alignment,
that.
right? It's really, I feel like it's alignment.
Well, I
with
think it's a
California.
combination of course passing and the courses that they're taking, maybe. But anyway, yeah, you're right. It's course. It's
Yeah.
based on those core courses in your freshman
Because
year.
the California kids have to have
Right, they
the
have
right
A through G
courses.
requirements.
Exactly, so
Mhm.
I'm not sure you could get at it with that.
No, these are students who are admitted. They've completed their A through G requirements. They've They're admitted and, yeah, it's really an alignment issue, I think. So,
But when you say they should get the information early, and I hate to come back to this, but
yeah.
where they're supposed to be getting that information is the course grades. right?
Yeah, that's it. There you
Well,
go.
and
So
the
the problem-
standardized
Probably
tests.
Getting the wrong message, right?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. They're clearly not getting the right message there.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, well, this has really been super, and since you all are insiders and here all the time, I don't need to go through all the regular spiel. So, we will be working to reschedule Paco's talk, and I will keep you posted about when that will be happening. And our spring seminar schedule, we have an exciting lineup, will be posted on the website soon. So, thank you so much for coming, and have a great holiday, and we will see you all in the new year.
Thank you all.